Ok, bueno, bienvenidos todos al Ateneo de Neurociencias. Hoy nos acompaña la doctora Samantha Moore con su charla Meta Perceptions Drive Us Apart, but Correcting Them Can Bring Us Together. Voy a hacer una breve introducción de la doctora Moore en español para todos los que nos están acompañando. La doctora Moore es profesora asistente en la Universidad de Utah. Fue becaria postdoctoral de Emile Bruneau y directora del Laboratorio de Neurociencia de Paz y de Conflicto en la Escuela Annenberg de Comunicación de la Universidad de Pensilvania. Su doctorado y su maestría es en Psicología Social en la Universidad de Temple y tiene una licenciatura en Psicología y Sociología de la Universidad Estatal de Florida. En su investigación, su objetivo principal es comprender los impulsores y las consecuencias del conflicto entre grupos y desarrollar intervenciones que combatan directamente el conflicto y la desigualdad sistémica. Su investigación está orientada en todo el mundo y evalúa e interviene en conflictos basados en polarización política, diferencias religiosas, discriminación racial y estados migratorios. Con esa introducción, welcome Samantha. I'm going to change to English now. It's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thank you for inviting me.
We have people, I'm sorry. As you know, we have people connected on YouTube, so you will not see them here, but I will gladly pass the questions that they have to you at the end of your presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here today to present to you all. So I will be talking about this concept called meta-perceptions, and I'll take a moment to tell you what it is, but I'll dive into it a little bit more deeply in my presentations. But meta-perceptions are what we think others think about us. And importantly, they can both drive us apart, but they can be a really nice way to intervene and bring people together, especially people who are in conflict. A large part of this talk will be talking about some of the research I do in the United States, but I'll have a little bit at the end about research that's been conducted on meta-perceptions in a more global perspective. So know that even though a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is US-based, it does relate to other contexts across the globe as well. And I'm actually currently conducting some research in Colombia looking at meta-perceptions as well. So I'll give you a sneak peek of that at the end. This is a flyer that was circulated by the Republican Party or the Conservative Party in the United States. And this was circulated as one of the tools or techniques to get people to donate. So imagine that you are a member of the Republican Party or the Conservative Party, and you read this. The top, it says, "The radical left hates you." It gives a couple of examples of prominent political leaders to describe why the radical left hates you. And then at the bottom, it says, "Contribute now to fight back." So it's using this tool of what we think others think about us as a way to ramp up donations to the political party. Now imagine if you're a Democrat or a liberal reading this flyer, and you think to yourself, that's not true about me or my party. This is what they think about us. And so you can see how we're forming these perceptions about what we think others think about us, and that can be used to encourage us to support our political group a little bit more. So what a meta-perception is, what I described previously, is this belief that people form about how other groups of people perceive reality. So this can be about how other people perceive your own group, or how other people perceive different social issues. And I've looked at both of them within my research. And we know from research that meta-perceptions tend to be subject to biases. They tend to guide what we perceive and how we perceive others. And they tend to be beliefs that we form. And in a lot of cases, not all cases, they tend to be false beliefs or misperceptions about the other side. And we've actually seen meta-perceptions play out and have some pretty dire social consequences in the US. So this was a picture from January 2021, right after Trump lost the election. There was a raid on the Capitol where a lot of Trump supporters thought that Biden stole the election and thought that the election was inappropriately designated or won by Biden. And a lot of social rhetoric and conversation that happened around this from those supporters suggested that it's something the left did, that this is the left hates us, the left wanted to steal the election. So these perceptions about what the left thought, or the liberals or Democrats thought, and it was used as a tactic to perhaps motivate, or one of the reasons to motivate the raid on the Capitol or the insurrection on the Capitol. Today, I'll be talking about meta-perceptions broadly. First, I'll be talking about whether or not meta-perceptions actually reflect reality. These couple of examples I gave you, are they true? Is it true that both sides really hate each other? Is it true that we think the other side dislikes us, and does that actually match reality? We'll focus on a consequence, whether or not these meta-perceptions are associated with toxic intergroup conflict. Then we'll focus on a solution, whether we can correct these inaccurate meta-perceptions, and whether correcting these can actually improve intergroup relations. And then finally, focusing on the big picture. Does this work extend beyond the United States context? So first, let's dive into whether or not these meta-perceptions actually reflect reality. There's this perception in the US that each side is out to get each other, and particularly to destroy America. This was a poll that was conducted last year around the midterm elections. And what we can see here is that both Democrats and Republicans believe that the other party's agenda will destroy America, will destroy democracy. But importantly, this is not a new phenomenon. And we've actually seen that affective polarization, or how much we like the other side, has actually decreased over time. We can see with the top green line that our feelings towards our in-group, or the group we're a part of, has remained pretty consistent and pretty positive. Our feelings towards our out-group has decreased over time throughout the years. And so this suggests that polarization has been increasing as a function of how we feel about the out-group, rather than our changing feelings about our in-group. Given this reality, does this map on then to what we think the other side thinks about us? Is this reflective of our meta-perceptions as well? We conducted a study to really test this question, and we asked, do meta-perceptions reflect reality? To do this study, we conducted a nationally representative survey of partisans that were representative based on race, age, education, and geographic location. There's just over 1,000 United States participants, and they're split pretty evenly between Democrats and Republicans. One of the psychological constructs we looked at is dehumanization and meta-dehumanization. Dehumanization is how much you think the other side is lacking humanity, or how unevolved you think the other side is. So for instance, we gave people this prompt. Some people think that people can vary in how human-like they seem. According to this view, some people seem highly evolved, whereas others seem no different than lower animals. Using the sliders below, indicate how evolved you considered each group to be. And this was taken from the Ascent of Man scale. And so participants, they saw a figure and they were rated Democrats and Republicans on how evolved or civilized they thought the other side was. Then we asked about meta-dehumanization, what we think the other group would say about us. So a very similar prompt. People can vary in how human-like they seem. Sometimes they seem more highly evolved than others. Indicate what you think Republicans would say. So if you're a Democrat, you're asked to think about what you think the other side would say. So how Republicans would rate Democrats and how Republicans would rate Republicans. And if you were a Republican, you're asked, how do you think Democrats would rate Democrats versus Republicans on this scale? So really getting at what do you think the other side thinks about you and their own group? And what we see for actual levels of dehumanization, so this is for the Republican participants. Republicans are typically associated with red or elephants in the US. And so we see that the actual bias is about 22 points. So Republicans, understandably, like their own group or humanize their own group more than the humanized Democrats. But it's not too much of a difference, but 22 points. And for Democrats, which is represented by blue or by donkeys in the US, we see a similar level of bias. So there's about a 22-point difference in how much humanization they associate with their own group versus the other group. Now turning to meta-dehumanization, what they think the other side would say. And what we see here is when we ask Democrats this question, what will Republicans say? Democrats think that Republicans would have about this 55-point difference, when in reality, Republicans only had about a 22-point actual bias. So we can see that it's about 2.5 times as much perceived bias than actual bias exists. And then when we ask Republicans this question, what do you think Democrats would say on this scale? They think that the perceived bias is 59 points, when in reality, again, the actual bias is 22 points. So we see both Democrats and Republicans have this meta perception, this meta dehumanization, that the other side is dehumanizing them much more than reality. Importantly, these effects extend to various social policies. We looked at a couple of different policies, one in particular about immigration policies. We kind of had a watered down version of the immigration situation in the US, but essentially we told people some Americans think that we should welcome people to visit and work temporarily in the US, but that our borders should be closed to those who wish to immigrate here. Other Americans think there should be no border restriction and that anybody should be free to immigrate to the US. And many people fall somewhere in between these extremes. So first we asked people to indicate where they personally fell on this spectrum. Do they think borders should be completely open to all immigrants, and borders should be completely closed to all migrants? And then we asked, if we ask this question to Americans who identify as Democrats, what do you think their average response would be? And likewise, we said, what do you think Republicans would say on this scale? And what we see here, this is how actually far apart Democrats and Republicans are. You can see there's a lot of variability in both Democrats and Republicans' positions, but there's a lot of position overlap between Democrats and Republicans. But we think that we're much further apart than we actually are. We think that there's very little overlap in our perceptions about this social issue. But in reality, again, there's a lot of position overlap between Democrats and Republicans. So what we see across these two examples with dehumanization and social policies is that our meta perceptions are 2 times more extreme than what we actually is expressed by outgroup political partisans. So then what might be a consequence? Are these meta perceptions associated with toxic intergroup conflict? From the beginning examples, I gave 2 examples, real-life examples of meta perceptions that can be used as a political tool in order to support one's own group. But do we see this in the research? Are meta perceptions associated with this toxic intergroup conflict? We looked at this looking at democratic attitudes. So in the same study that I just talked about, seeing whether or not those meta perceptions are associated with anti-democratic attitudes. There are 5 items in total for this scale, and participants rated how much they agreed with the following characteristics, and I'll give 2 examples. The first is, I think in-group members, so the group I belong to, should do everything within their power, within the law, to make it as difficult as possible for the outgroup, the group I don't belong to take part in governing the country. A second example, in-group members should redraw districts to maximize their potential to win more seats in federal elections, even if it may be technically illegal. And they rated these group of questions on a scale ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. What we see here in this figure that I'm about to show you, we have meta dehumanization on the bottom, which is this perceived bias score that I talked about a little bit earlier. So this is the difference between how outgroups perceive to rate the outgroup versus in-group. So again, that perceived bias difference score I pointed out. Larger scores here mean greater perceived bias. And on the y-axis, these are the anti-democratic attitudes. So we see, again, variability, but for Democrats and Republicans, the more meta-dehumanization you have, the more likely you are to support these anti-democratic attitudes. So we see here that there's an association between our meta-perceptions, our meta-dehumanization, and whether or not we support these anti-democratic attitudes. So again, to reiterate, meta-perceptions tend to be 2 times more extreme than our actual perceptions, and these are associated with anti-democratic attitudes. Does this phenomenon extend to other types of meta-perceptions? You might be wondering and asking yourself. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of people feel, or there's a substantial amount of Americans who think that the election was stolen, that Trump should have won the election. And this then translated to people who are on the ballot during the midterm elections who denied the election, who denied the 2020 election. So 60% Americans had somebody on their ballot who actually denied the results of the elections, which suggests that there's this fundamental breakdown in democracy. So the question then becomes, do people misperceive outpartisan support for various democratic norms? If one of the democratic norms in the United States is that we have elections that are true, that are representative of what the people actually want, do we misperceive this outpartisan support for these democratic norms because of what we saw, particularly in 2020? To answer this question, we collected 2 nationally representative samples, again, representative based on race, age, education, geographic location. And in total, there's about 2,200 United States partisans split between Democrats and Republicans. And I'll present both studies together just for sake of simplicity and because they replicated each other. We looked at anti-democratic principles. There was 4 items in total, and participants first rated how important they found the various characteristics. The first characteristic being elections are conducted, ballots counted, and winners determined without any pervasive fraud or manipulation. The second, all adult citizens enjoy the same legal and political rights. The third, government agencies are not used to monitor, attack, or punish political opponents. And law enforcement investigations of public officials or their associates are free from political influence or interference. And these are largely discussed by scholars as the tenets of democracy in the United States. And they rated these 4 items on a scale ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Then we asked them to rate what they thought the average Democrat and the average Republican would say. So again, getting at our meta perceptions. And what we found here is that both Democrats and Republicans strongly support these democratic characteristics. This is a density plot, and you can see that for both Democrats and Republicans, again, Republicans being the red, Democrats being the blue, that they're both skewed to the right, which means both groups highly support these democratic characteristics. When we ask what they think the other side would say, whether or not they think the other side would value these democratic characteristics, we see here, this figure is for predicting for the average Democrat. We see that Democrats think their own group values these norms, but Republicans don't think that Democrats value these characteristics. You can see because the line's flat. And the opposite pattern, but same pattern for predicting for the average Republican. So Republicans think their own group values these norms, but Democrats do not think that Republicans value these norms. Then we wondered whether or not they're associated with willingness to violate democratic principles. And these are the same democratic principles that I presented in the past study, the previous study I talked about. And we see here that for both Democrats and Republicans, that the greater bias you have, the more meta perceptions you have, the more willing you are to violate these democratic principles. So even if you personally value these democratic norms, you're willing to violate them if you think the other side is going to violate them. And we see the same pattern in the other study as well, except a little bit stronger for Republican participants. So what we see in this study is that both Democrats and Republicans highly value democratic norms, but they think that the other side does not value these democratic norms. So the takeaway is, if we think they're cheating, so will we. We are going to cheat as well if we think they are cheating too. It gives us a license to cheat. The next thing to talk about is if we know that these meta-perceptions are inaccurate, but we also know that these inaccurate meta-perceptions can drive harmful intergroup relationships. What can we do about it to correct our meta-perceptions? And by correcting our inaccurate meta-perceptions, can we then improve our intergroup relations? So in this third study, we looked at whether or not correcting inaccurate meta-perceptions can improve our intergroup relations. And to do so, we produced a video intervention in partnership with a nonprofit organization, Beyond Conflict. Beyond Conflict is a translational science nonprofit that really brings together practitioners and researchers in order to reduce conflict within society and within global society. And we also partnered with a professional filmmaker and storyteller. His name is Wayne Price. And what we did was we developed an intervention video that I'll show you in a moment. And in this intervention video, we brought in real partisans who gave both their perceptions and their meta-perceptions. And what you'll be able to see is that both the partisans are really grappling with meta-perceptions, what they think the other side thought about them. And then when we give them the real information, you'll be able to see how they really act with surprise when they're told that actually the other side doesn't dehumanize you as much as you thought, doesn't dislike you as much as you thought. And so let's take a moment to watch this video. It's about 3.5 minutes.
I feel like when I walk out into the world, I'm just waiting for somebody to start a fight.
Confederate flag waving Trump MAGA hat. Proud Boys.
If you believe in Trump, you are automatically the worst person in the world.
If you don't agree, then don't agree. But to be angry.
Oh, we assume the other side assumes the worst of us.
I hear a lot of conservative boomers call Democrats democrats.
They just shut down somebody else completely. They just have this wall up and they don't even want to hear it.
We asked over 1,200 Americans across race, gender, ethnic, and socioeconomic divides about some political topics.
I voted for Trump.
I voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 election.
Biden.
President Donald J. Trump.
I voted for Joe Biden.
Biden, for sure.
If you want to just keep it as a Republican, we can just keep it simple, but
I voted for Donald Trump.
Biden and Harris.
I voted for Joe Biden. You just had to stay silent. I was afraid to put a Trump sign in my yard.
I did not vote in the 2020 election.
Biden.
Joe Biden.
I voted for Donald Trump.
We began with immigration.
I'm a DACA recipient.
It's safer to have closed borders.
Every single human has the right to succeed.
Few people are like, just leave the door wide open. Whee!
100% of legal immigrants to be allowed to come into this country legally.
Members of each party were asked to rate their own views on immigration based on a general preference for closed or open borders. In our survey, 0 means keeping all borders completely open to all migrants, and 100 means keeping all borders completely closed to all migrants.
Maybe like 25?
I would be a 10, let's say.
I would say that I lie at 40.
Like 20.
80, 85. About the 40.
I would say 15 on that scale.
We then asked them to answer the same question. However, estimating how the average member of the other party would rate their view.
100.
10.
100. They would probably think that me as a Democrat is a 0.
In that 10 to 20 range.
0.
Probably 90 to 100.
Oh, they'd probably think that I was like 0.
10, honestly.
And finally, we shared the results of the 2
Okay.
questions.
That's amazing. Oh.
There's so much more overlap than I think we realize.
We also asked Republicans and Democrats to rate how evolved they think members of the other party would see them.
Oh, at a 0.
And then how evolved they actually view members of the other party themselves.
Like to say that they're less than human.
I wouldn't put anyone who disagrees with my views as subhuman.
they're just as human as I am.
I would also put Democrats at 100. They are human beings also.
For Republicans?
In reality, Republicans and Democrats viewed each other about twice as evolved and civilized as members of each party predicted.
Yep. What we see when we turn on the TV and what we read on social media does not depict that.
Sure, we don't always see the world exactly the same way, but we're not nearly as different as we think.
I feel like
We tested this video in a couple of different settings. So one way we did it was various pilot testing to see whether or not it was successful. And then we did a larger representative assessment to see if this video reduced meta-perceptions, thereby reducing harmful intergroup relationships. And we saw in those contexts it worked. But another context that we looked at this intervention was with an intervention tournament or a mega study. What an intervention tournament does is it compares several different interventions against a single control. It utilizes the same standardized outcome measures during assessments, and it recruits participants from the same population. So really able to look to see whether or not one intervention or a couple interventions stand out as effective at reducing conflict compared to others. We entered this into this tournament called the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, which what this tournament was it asked anybody, really anybody, to contribute an intervention idea to this tournament. And the goal was to see whether or not one intervention was most effective at reducing toxic polarization, which I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And so in total, there was 26 different interventions or 25 interventions plus a control that was entered into this intervention condition, this intervention tournament. And these interventions were tested with a nationally representative sample of partisans that varied by race, age, education, geographic location. And in total, in this whole study, there was 32,000 participants. In our intervention condition, there's just over 1,000 participants, and in the control, there's 5,600 participants. One way that we assessed partisan animosity or toxic polarization is with partisan animosity. There's 2 items in total for this measure, and these items were standardized and averaged together. The first was a feeling thermometer, where participants were asked how warm or cold do they feel towards the outgroup. And they rated on this scale ranging from 0 to 100. The second was a dictator game. And this is an economic game where you're given a sum of money, an actual sum of money, and you're told you can either keep some for yourself or you can give it away to the other group. And the goal is to see how much money they're giving away to the other group. And this is a behavioral game because participants actually get to keep the amount that they say they want to keep, and we actually give away the amount that they say they want to give to the other group. So these are all the different interventions that were in this intervention tournament. And you can see that our intervention, which is called the misperception film, was really successful compared to these other interventions at reducing partisan animosity. So here was 5th most successful at reducing partisan animosity, and these effects persisted at least 2 weeks after. So it has substantial and lasting effects on reducing partisan animosity. Another way we looked at toxic polarization was with support for undemocratic practices. There's 4 items in total here, and participants rated how much they support the following items, of which I'll give 2 examples. The first is that in-group members should reduce the number of polling stations in areas that support out-group members, or that in-group members should not accept the results of the elections if they lose. And they indicated whether or not they disagreed or agreed with these items. Again, these are all of the interventions that were in the tournament. And you can see now that our intervention was 3rd most successful at reducing support for undemocratic practices. And as compared to the partisan animosity outcome, there are much fewer interventions that actually reduced support for undemocratic practices, and most did not. And some, as you can see on the lower right of the scale, actually backfired and increased support for undemocratic practices. But we were very excited that our film actually reduced support in this space. And then finally, we looked at support for violence. There are 4 items in total here, and participants rated how important they found the various characteristics, of which I'll give 2 examples. The first is, how much do you feel it's justified for an in-group to use violence in advancing their political goals these days? A second example, how much do you feel it's justified for in-group members to use violence if the out-group party wins more races in the next election? And they rated this on a scale ranging from never to always. So again, these are all the conditions. And what you can see is ours at the top. Our intervention was most effective at reducing support for partisan violence. And in fact, only 5 interventions in this tournament actually reduced support for partisan violence. And importantly, our intervention film was one of only 3 interventions that reduced all 3 outcomes. We were really excited to see that compared to a bunch of other really great interventions, that this intervention, that this misperception film was so effective. And again, we replicated this in other contexts to see whether or not the effects lasted. And we saw within our own individual studies that they worked as well. So we're really excited by this film. Again, what we see here is that correcting these misperceptions can then reduce this harmful intergroup relationship, intergroup attitudes, and behaviors, as denoted by the economic game that we had within this study. So then finally, how does this work extend beyond the United States? Is this just a United States phenomenon, or do we see similar meta-perceptions in other places, and do they also predict other consequences as well? So I'm first going to talk about a study that I wasn't actually a part of, but that looked at meta-perceptions across the globe. So in this study, they looked at meta-perceptions in a bunch of different places across the globe. And what we can see here is that the red dots are first order perceptions. So what we actually think about the other side are regular perceptions. The green dots are in-group meta-perceptions, what we think our own group would say. And then the blue dot is out-group meta-perceptions, what we think the other group would say. And in every single case, except for down at the bottom, Sudan, but in every single case, we see that our out-group meta-perceptions are much more negative than actual perceptions. So across all these different countries, we see that our meta-perceptions tend to be much more negative than our actual perceptions. And they measured a bunch of different types of meta-perceptions in each different country, so it really varied, but aggregating across those perceptions, the consistent finding is that our meta-perceptions tend to be more negative than actual perceptions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I conducted recently a study in Colombia looking at meta-perceptions, and we see the same pattern of results, that our meta-perceptions tend to be more negative than our actual perceptions. Now, I just did a very quick analysis of this morning, so I don't have a very fancy figure or anything to show, but you can take my word for it that we still see these patterns of results replicate in Colombia as well. So what I presented today is I presented this illusion that meta-perceptions tend to be more negative than actual perceptions. I also presented a potential consequence that these inaccurate meta-perceptions tend to be associated with toxic intergroup conflict. I presented a solution that correcting these inaccurate meta-perceptions can then improve intergroup relations, and I presented this solution with what I think is a pretty compelling video. And then finally, I talked about the big picture, that meta-perceptions are a global issue. So the key takeaway here is that these meta-perceptions should probably really be called meta-misperceptions, because we do have these misperceptions about the other side, and in particular, what we think the other side thinks about us. And that these meta-misperceptions, because or as a result of them being so inaccurate, they can be really malleable and a really nice way to intervene, because we're not actually intervening on people's perceptions. We're intervening on what we think the other side thinks about us. So it could be an easier sell than actually asking people to change their attitudes. And what we've seen through the research is that by having people correct their meta perceptions, and that can have downstream consequences for actually improving perceptions between groups. So not only are we reducing toxic intergroup conflict, but we're also actually making people like each other a little bit more, dehumanize each other a little bit less. And we see the success of this type of intervention across the globe as well. And so with that, just to acknowledge some of the team members who've helped with this research: Rebecca Littman, Roman Gallardo, Nora Katali, Lior and Corey Klinsky, Emil Bruneau, and Boaz Samari, as well as I did most of this research when I was a postdoc at Penn, and then Beyond Conflict for their partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. We have some questions in YouTube, and then I also have a couple questions of my own, so I'm gonna do them too.
Perfect.
So the first question that we have is if this research has been mainly realized with political groups that are usually elected, or if we could expect like similar results when we're talking about conflicts that are based on different types of groups, like for example, ethnic groups. Yes. Or social groups. Yeah.
Great. Should I stop sharing my screen for this? What would be easier?
I mean, if you want to go back in your presentation to show something, or if you want to stop sharing it, like whatever you prefer, it's fine.
Great. See, for now, you can look at my lovely co-authors. So this research has been replicated in a bunch of different places. So it's not just with political groups, but we also see it with different ethnic groups as well. So there's been some research conducted by Emil and Noor, who are on the screen right here, that looked at meta perceptions, particularly in the US, between Muslims and non-Muslims. And they see similar types of meta perceptions play out, that people think that the other side dislikes them and dehumanizes them, but then in reality, that's not the case. And that, again, providing an intervention, in their case, they presented a newspaper article that really debunked these meta perceptions, that they can be corrected as well. So in that context, they looked at between Muslims and non-Muslims. We've also done some work looking at other groups as well. So we've did some research looking throughout Europe at really majority and minority groups within those contexts, oftentimes racial groups, majority and minority racial relations. And we see the same pattern of results as well, that we think that the other side dehumanizes us, but in reality, they do not dehumanize us as much as we think we do. And that then can translate to harmful intergroup relations. So this is not just a political phenomenon, and it actually expands to other types of intergroup relations as well.
Thank you. Does this mean, I'm gonna try to formulate this question because I don't know much about the topic, but I'm really interested in it. And it's like, so meta perceptions are usually social perceptions. Like there is no such thing as an individual. Like what is the difference between social meta perceptions or individual meta perceptions? Is this a thing? Like could they happen outside of like a social cultural context, or are they usually mediated by that?
So I've typically looked at it within a social context, so between groups in general, but there has been some research looking at meta perceptions and specifically meta stereotypes at the individual level. So bringing two people together and asking what they think the other person thinks of them after an interaction. And then they use that to judge how the interaction went and to whether or not that influences future attitudes about that person or about that person's social group as a whole. And they've seen similar levels of results at the individual level as well. So this was some of the really early meta perception research that was maybe conducted 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so that really inspired us to look at it at more of a group level and to see these individual differences that we're seeing at the individual level with meta perceptions influencing our intergroup interactions with a dyadic intervention or a dyadic interaction between two people. We see those same patterns of results when we look at it at a group level as well between social groups.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have another question, and the question asks about like the role of the media. So what is the role in the media of the media in building this meta perceptions? But it also asks, like, besides the media, what is contributing to these meta perceptions? So what are the causes of these meta perceptions to be built, like in people's, like, yeah, cognitive processes? Mhm.
Yeah, media is definitely a very big piece of it. So that would have been my first answer if you didn't ask specifically about the media. The media tends to, I would say, fuel our meta perceptions because oftentimes we don't have a lot of interaction with the other side. So sometimes we do, but a lot of times the information that we're gathering about the other side tends to be from the media, just because there's a lot of partisan sorting that exists in the political context, where we're living in neighborhoods or we're living in spaces that we're surrounded by people who are like us. So we don't oftentimes have exposure to what the other side thinks about us. So then we're gathering this information from the media. And if we're gathering this information from the media oftentimes presents images in oftentimes a partisan way, or a way that promotes, confirms the biases that we already have. Now, what's interesting is I have some data looking at exposure to the other side's political media. And what we see is that you have lower meta perceptions. So your meta perceptions are less accurate the more you watch the other side's news. Now, this could be because you have lower meta perceptions to begin with. So you're more likely to want to watch the other side's news because you just simply have lower meta perceptions. Or maybe there's something about watching the other side's news or being exposed to it that helps correct what you think about the other side, or what you think the other side thinks about you. And so that's some of the emerging research that's coming from our lab, looking at the relationship between meta perceptions and media. But largely, I would say that meta perceptions can be quite harmful, or the media can be quite harmful for our meta perceptions, largely because of the information that they're putting out there. And because, too, the media oftentimes promotes the loudest and the most extreme voices. And if what we're exposed to is the most extreme voices on both sides, then that, again, can influence what we think the other side thinks about us. When in reality, if the media is not focusing on the large majority of the group, which perhaps doesn't have these extreme opinions or these extreme views, then we're really missing a critical part of the population. And that can be one way that the media can be harmful to intergroup relations, because it's fueling these meta perceptions. Now, other things that could relate to our meta perceptions is how strongly we feel identified with our group. So what we've seen is that there's a strong relationship between our social identity and how strongly we feel with either being Democrat or Republican, and our meta perceptions, where the stronger view you have, or the stronger connection you have to your social group, the more likely you are to have these extreme negative meta perceptions. And which I think really at a whole makes sense, right? The more you feel close to your group, the stronger you are to have these perceptions that the other side dislikes you or dehumanizes you, as a way to kind of fuel your identification with your own group. So social identity can be a really big part of it as well. We've looked at other individual differences, such as race or ethnicity. Those things tend to not be as correlated with our political meta perceptions. But if you're looking at meta perceptions in other contexts, for instance, racial or religious meta perceptions, I imagine you'd find a similar pattern of results that we see with the partisan meta perceptions, that the closer you feel to your social identity, the more likely you are to have these stronger negative meta perceptions.
Thank you so much. That is so interesting. Like, I feel like it's blowing my mind in terms of how it works, because it like shows the reality so clearly. I think that this is also a big thing, not only in the United States. I know that you're starting to make research in other parts, and
right.
I feel like, for example, here in Colombia right now, there is something very similar happening, I would say. So that's super interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. We have another question in the chat, if that's okay for you.
Yeah.
And is, are there like any ideas of which could be the variables that explain why, why are some people like more like, okay, the question is in Spanish, so I'm trying to translate it
No
on the
problem.
go. So
Take your time.
I'm sorry, I'll redo it. So basically what they're asking is like, do we know which could be like variables that explain why these videos are more effective for some people than for others?
We looked again at individual differences for this, and we didn't see a lot of variability based on those things. We saw for political identification again that the more strongly you were connected with your own political identification, the more effective this video was for changing your meta perceptions. And this is probably because there was the most room for improvement with that group, because partisans who have the strongest social identities with their group tend to have the strongest negative meta perceptions. And so there's just more room to actually improve meta perceptions in this context, because they're just much more extreme than perhaps people who don't really feel identified with either party. So that's one effect that we saw with social identity. The Strengthening Democracy Challenge looked at some other maybe different cognitive factors, and there wasn't one cognitive factor that really stood out as why these interventions are really effective. So it's still ongoing research that's hopefully going to be conducted, and we're hoping to conduct it on our intervention video in particular, really looking at the mechanisms behind why an intervention works and who it works best for, and perhaps ways we can tailor the intervention to make it more effective to people who maybe find it less appealing than others.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Samantha. Those are all the questions that we have in the chat for now. But I think timing was perfect, and I wanted to thank you for being part of this academic talks that are so important to us. And yeah, I'm guessing if there's someone specially interested in what you're doing, are they like, do they have the permission to contact you directly?
Oh, for sure. My email's on the screen. Please reach out to me. I'm happy to meet with anybody to talk about this or other things. I'm always happy to chat.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for this talk. As I mentioned before, it's going to be on YouTube, like on the YouTube channel of the university. I will share it with you in case you want to share it with other people. I know that sometimes having the talk recorded can be especially helpful for academics, so I will share it with you as soon as I have the link.
I appreciate
and
that.
Thank you so much again.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed it, and I know that people who are connected also did.
Great. Thank you. This is wonderful.
Okay. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.